Good evening, I'm Dan Jennings, and this is Dan-splaining. On Friday, while most of the country was either shopping or recovering from a tryptophan overload, the White House decided to release the semi-annual climate change report. The reasons they chose this date are self-evident, and I will not dignify the ludicrous comments made on the report by 45 with a response. No, tonight's Dan-splaining is directed right at former Senator Rick Santorum and others who continually push the false narrative that climate change research is an agenda driven solely by scientists looking for funding. On CNN's State of the Union show Sunday morning, the former senator said, and I quote, "If there was no climate change, we'd have a lot of scientists looking for work. The reality is that a lot of these scientists are driven by the money that they receive. And of course, they don't receive money from corporations and Exxon and the like. Why? Because they're not allowed to. Because it's tainted. But they can receive it from people who support their agenda. And that, I believe, is what's really going on here." End quote. However, what the senator conveniently fails to mention is a timeline of oil company research into the effects of fossil fuels on climate change, and thank you to Climate Liabilities Research for this information. July 1977, James Black, a scientist at Exxon, told the company's top management that scientific evidence shows burning fossil fuels was indeed causing climate change. In May of 1981, in a paper written for Exxon's head of research, company scientist Henry Shaw estimated that global temperatures will increase by 3 degrees Celsius with the doubling of the carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, which could cause catastrophic impacts as early as the first half of the 21st century. And here we are. November 1982, Exxon distributed a paper internally on climate change that advised major reductions in fossil fuel combustion for limiting of global warming. In June of 1988, James Hansen, a NASA scientist, testified during a congressional hearing that human activities were causing global warming. It was the first major public warning of a looming climate crisis. Also in 1988, Shell prepared an internal report called The Greenhouse Effect that analyzed the impacts of climate change. It noted that fossil fuel burning was driving climate change and quantified the carbon emissions from its products such as oil, coal, and gas made up 4% of global emissions in 1984. In 1989, in a move to coordinate a public response to the growing attention on climate change, a group of big businesses, including Exxon, Senator Santorum, BP, and Shell, formed a global climate coalition. It set out to cast doubt on climate science and lobby against efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In February of 1995, an internal report by Shell warned that fossil fuel burning was the main source of man-made emissions that was driving global warming, and this fact could have major business implications for the fossil fuel industry. In 1991, a 30-minute video produced by Shell included dire predictions and images of fires, floods, and food shortages. A narrator included this ominous warning: global warming is not yet certain, but many think that to wait for final proof would be irresponsible. Action now is seen as the only safe insurance. In 1996, Exxon solidified its public stance on dealing with climate change when Chief Executive Lee Raymond wrote an article for a company publication saying that scientific evidence was inconclusive on whether humans were contributing to climate change. In 1997, Exxon took out an ad in the New York Times that was titled "Reset the Alarm," which said, "Let's face it, the science of climate change is too uncertain to mandate a plan of action that could plunge economies into turmoil." It also read, "We still don't know what role man-made greenhouse gases might play in warming the planet." They knew. 1998, in a speech to employees, Lucio Noto, chief executive of Mobil Oil, this was before its merger with Exxon, told employees who apparently were upset about what they think was Mobil's negative attitude on the Kyoto Climate Agreement. His speech was captured on video. He said, while there's a connection between greenhouse gases and climate change, we are also not prepared to admit that the science is a closed fact and that we should take draconian steps to reduce CO2 gases. He also said that the company should try to reduce its operational emissions as well as those produced by customers. In 1998, Shell produced a document called the Shell Internal TINA Group Scenarios. The 1998 to 2020 report, which included modeling a future that included oil companies and governments being held liable for climate impacts. Its scenario eerily described the U.S. being hit with fierce storms in 2010, followed by activist groups initiating legal liability cases. In reality, the biggest storm hit the East Coast in 2012, Superstorm Sandy, and liability cases began to stir after that. In 2009, in a filing with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, Exxon acknowledged that humans were causing climate change. In 2013, a study by Richard Head, published in the journal Climatic Change, showed that 90 companies are responsible for 2/3 of the carbon emissions since the start of the industrial age in the mid-18th century. And in August of 2017, a Harvard study that analyzed Exxon's internal papers and public statements, as well as their campaigns, showed that the company misled the public about what it knew about the risk of climate change. The peer-reviewed study concluded that Exxon emphasized doubts about the scientific evidence that blamed fossil fuel burning for global warming when communicating with the public, while acknowledging the issue more forthrightly in internal documents. So, the senator is either woefully ignorant of the facts or willfully misleading in his comments. Take your pick. This does not even address the common sense factual notion that if one person says something, you can dismiss it. If two say it, you could question it. However, when over 90% of the world's scientists say in peer-reviewed studies that mankind is the number one contributing factor to climate change and catastrophic effects will follow, you can do neither. Unless we, the people, demand from our leaders immediate action on climate change, then this is what we'll have to look forward to. Extreme hot weather will become more common and cold weather more rare. Climate change, which has already doubled the devastation from wildfires in the Southwest, will continue to increase. Analysts estimate that the area burned by wildfire in the last 30 years was twice that what it would have been had climate change not occurred. Coastal effects of climate change show that sea level rise alone could force tens of millions of people to move from their homes within the next century. The question we need to ask the greediest among us is, when climate change very possibly precipitates the next world war over food and water shortages, or at worst, an extinction-level event, what good will your money be to you then? Your short-sightedness and lascivious nature is endangering the planet and destroying our futures. Resistance, as we have seen, is not futile, and the time for change is now, because if not now, there will not be a when. For the Blue Wave Report, I'm Dan Jennings.
Don't just comment, act.
Good night, everybody.